AI Speakers Forum. Oh, and we're recording. So it is now 12 o'clock. So I will start. So welcome to the third in UNZ's AI Speaker Series Forum and the final webinar for 2024. And before we begin, Bronwyn will open with a karakia.
Kia ora. Thank you, Liz. Can everybody hear me and see the karakia?
Yep.
Right. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I waho, tu taua mai I roto. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. We are delighted to have as our guest speaker today, Dr. James Pavur. James was a recent visitor to New Zealand in September as part of an AI speaker programme, which was organised by the public diplomacy team at the US Embassy. James is a senior advisor and presidential innovation fellow at the United States Department of State's Office of the Special Envoy for Critical and Emerging Technology. Goodness, that's a big, long title. In this role, he focuses on the technical dimension of AI technologies and their relationship to foreign affairs. Previous roles, including leading an infrastructure and security team at a digital engineering startup and working for the Pentagon's Defense Digital Service and Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. He holds a DPhil from Oxford University's Department of Computer Science, courtesy of a Rhodes Scholarship, where his research focused on space systems security. Sounds fascinating. He also holds a Bachelor's of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University's Walter School of Foreign Service. Beyond academia, James has delivered multiple briefings at the DEF CON and Black Hat hacking conferences, and his research has been covered by several popular press outlets. Please welcome Dr. James Pavur. James, I haven't introduced everybody who's on the screen. However, we do have people from a whole range of universities, New Zealand committees, including the IT committee, the planning group. I can't remember who else, quite a lot of other groups. And because there are so many people present, I thought what we'd do is when people ask you questions, they'll introduce themselves at that point. Okay, so James, can I hand over to you, please? And I'm going to mute my microphone.
Thank you for the flattering introduction. I'm super excited to be talking to this audience and especially on this subject. It's one of those situations where I feel like I'm actually less qualified to give the talk than some of you, but that's the kind of situation I love to seek out. So I'd really appreciate input and ideas here. So by way of background, the office I work for at the State Department coordinates the US's international strategy in critical and emerging tech. And we focus in three areas: AI, quantum, and biotech as kind of the main domains that we work on. And I advise in the AI policy portfolio. As was mentioned, I took this trip out to New Zealand a few months ago for this science speakers tour and engaged with a lot of folks on the concept of data sovereignty and robust language models, especially in Te Reo Maori. And I found that the community in New Zealand was like significantly ahead of much of the world in thinking about this problem space, both from a technical aspect, but also from a social and cultural dimensions. So really excited to kind of get your thoughts on this topic as I go through my presentation. I think we'll have time for questions at the end. But I'd really also welcome ideas and inputs and corrections as well. My goal was really to go back to the US and think about ways that we can get better in this domain and generally in the way that we approach AI internationally. So there are approximately 7,000 languages spoken globally today. And these are languages that are actually spoken by people. They aren't like esoteric toy languages. These are the ways people go about their lives, how they engage with family members, how they engage with their culture and their history. And of these 3,000 languages, almost half are at risk of becoming extinct over the course of our lifetimes or shortly thereafter. These are languages that children may no longer be speaking at home or learning natively. And so as a result, the future of these languages is extremely uncertain. And most of these languages exist in kind of these regions of the world that are diverse linguistic hotbeds, one of which is the Greater Pacific region, where there are thousands of languages, as well as several other hotbeds in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, where about half of the endangered languages on Earth are currently spoken. But even in the gray parts of these maps, the areas that aren't linguistic hotbeds, linguistic diversity is a huge part of who we are. In the United States, where I'm from, our government estimates that there are about 350 languages spoken by Americans in their homes and as part of their daily lives. That's an immense number of different ways that people communicate with each other and talk about the world. And I think that this linguistic diversity is really enriching, both for our country and also for the global community. And it gives us a different way of engaging with many aspects of our lives. Language is a really important tool for communicating and understanding concepts. Different languages prioritize different ways of talking about a subject. The grammars kind of preface and highlight different core concepts when you try to communicate about something. Additionally, language is a really important way of engaging with cultural treasures, as well as being a treasure in its own right. Language is kind of this production of history over the course of all of the people who have spoken English to each other. The work that they've done, the communications and exchanges they've had, become the speech that I'm giving you today. Every word here has come out of someone else's mouth in some different context, and I'm kind of adding to that cultural soup of language. And that's true for any language, but also language is an important way to engage with the treasures of our past. To read a poem in its original language is dramatically different from reading that same poem or saying that same prayer in a translated context. And there's something really important about having these 7,000 languages and being able to see the treasures that they've produced over their histories. Finally, languages kind of encourage diversity of perspective. When you say something in a different language, like I mentioned before, the way you approach it may be a little bit different. The things that you highlight, the way you express and describe ideas can be different in a way that's enriching to the people who receive and engage with those ideas in our global community. And so hopefully this audience is largely agreed that we should try to preserve languages and we should try to work to cultivate kind of linguistic flourishing, and that these 3,000 languages that are at risk of extinction are treasures that we shouldn't lose. To some extent, the importance of language and these benefits are why machine learning and the kind of topic that brought me to New Zealand and has me giving this talk today has become so important and so dominant. The kind of seminal paper for the latest era of artificial intelligence, which describes transformer models and this concept of attention, was born out of trying to solve the translation problem, specifically the idea of moving information from one language to another is so nuanced and so sophisticated that we basically taught machines to think in order to solve the problem. Like much of what we've done in AI has its origins in the specific task of translation. So it's somewhat odd that the state-of-the-art language models today have poor performance in most global languages. Many of these models support maybe 30, 40 really globally dominant languages. Think like English, Chinese, French, Spanish, but none of the thousands of additional languages. And even for some of those dominant languages, think something like Malaysian or Hindi, the performance of the models in those languages is pretty lackluster. The models will often switch languages mid-sentences, they'll make up words, they'll add characters that don't actually exist in the language when they're generating answers. And so there's quite a lot of work to be done in building these models in a way that they can appropriately and reliably speak in a foreign language. So why is this the case? Why are these models so bad, despite the fact that the technology seems intrinsically well-suited towards the translation task? One of the first things that people will point to when they're talking about this problem space is the data scarcity problem. And that's where most of my talk today is going to focus. And that's this fundamental problem that there aren't a lot of data sets out there for teaching models global languages. A lot of the models in the state of the art today are trained with content that's scraped from the internet. which is overwhelmingly in English. This is despite the fact that the internet itself may not be overwhelmingly in English. That's kind of a disputed fact. But because of the way that we bias for authority when we're teaching these models to speak a language, we tend to lean towards global publications, big popular websites that speak the lingua franca of the day, which is English. And so the data sets are extremely English dominant. But beyond the lack of data in a lot of these lower resource languages, there's also talent barriers. Building a language model is still an art form in a lot of ways. There's like kind of the broad structures of how you would build an LLM, but it's a very niche tradecraft in terms of actually developing a production-ready language model that can speak a given language. And if you aren't a native speaker of the output language, it's very hard to refine the model to speak that language appropriately. There is a degree of both fluency and engineering skill that needs to be kind of combined, so that when you see an output and you see it's kind of a bit clunky or a bit repetitive or doesn't understand a tense or includes like a certain kind of slang or jargon, you know, hey, something's wrong with my training set or my hyperparameters that are causing the model to behave in this weird way. That kind of intuition is extremely hard for someone who doesn't speak a language to understand. So when you take a language that has relatively few speakers, and then this incredibly niche tradecraft of building large language models, the total number of people who have the skill set, the interest, the capability, and the time to solve these problems is incredibly small. Finally, the driver of a lot of our growth and development in AI right now has been commercial. It's been businesses that are looking to reach customer bases and sell AI as a product. And almost definitionally, endangered and low resource languages have smaller customer bases than dominant languages. And so there often aren't the incentives to spend the massive amounts of labor and time and capital to train and tune leading frontier models in niche languages or in low resource languages. In this talk, I'm going to kind of break down each of these three from my perspective as someone who's engaged with this problem for a little bit, and talk about kind of emerging trends I'm seeing and opportunities to overcome these challenges. And then I'd love to get your inputs and thoughts on things I might have missed or things that I might misunderstand in this domain, as well as things you've seen in your experience in New Zealand and in academia that might play into helping solve these problems together. So the first topic is data scarcity, that lack of linguistic models and data sets for low resource languages, the inherent low resource problem of training a model to work in a low resource language. And there are a couple of approaches to data scarcity. One idea is to just increase the amount of data that is available. There's been a lot of work on taking kind of the old generation of data sets, which focus primarily on, like I mentioned, very authoritative English language sources, and expanding the corpus they're trained on to include forums in foreign languages or social media accounts to kind of expand the capacity of this data set so that it might be able to express additional languages. And you'll often see paper titles like this one saying, you know, our language model has seen 167 languages, which doesn't sound impressive next to the 7,000 number I mentioned earlier, but it's still a pretty impressive corpus of languages for a given data set. Unfortunately, when you dig into a lot of these multilingual models, you'll still find that English is extremely dominant, and the languages that follow it are often still kind of these predominant global languages. They're in many ways just scraping the internet, no matter what scale you do it at, is going to have a bias towards global languages because the internet is a global communications medium. Another approach is to try to build tailored data sets to solve this problem. Focus on a specific language, get as much data as you possibly can in that language, and publish it as a data set. And this is a really useful resource for people who are working on low resource languages. For example, this data set here is in Hawaiian. It consists of 260 megabytes of Hawaiian data, which is not like much data in the Hawaiian language, but it's certainly an ample corpus, and there's quite a lot of information in there that you could use to build or fine-tune or refine or test the language model. Unfortunately, when you see these projects to build specific language data sets, they often end up building kind of weird data sets. For example, this Hawaiian data set is 1% text from the Bible. And this is pretty common in low resource languages. The Bible is a extremely well translated book. It exists in a lot of languages. But when 1% of your data set is thou shalts and thou shalt nots, as opposed to like day-to-day conversation, you end up with a model that has perhaps overly learned kind of esoteric language or historic language or kind of like weird language that's not spoken. And so when people go to use the tools, they may feel unnatural, much like if you were engaging with a tool that was trained primarily on the Bible and English. And so figuring out how to build useful data into these data sets as we're building them out is an ongoing research challenge, and figuring out exactly like how much Bible you can slip into your data set before it becomes too wonky, I think is definitely like an ongoing area for academic research in low resource languages. One approach that I've heard anecdotally from engineers is that you can take basically any ambient low quality data set, like something that's predominantly the Bible and random Wikipedia articles. And if you combine that with some very high quality data generated by humans, even small amounts of what they call instruction pairs. So these are like basically conversations of the sort that you would have with a large language model, and then the desired response you'd want the model to give you as you were having that conversation. You can get significant performance gains for the specific use case. And the amount of data you need in this context is relatively low. So I was speaking with some engineers who have been building language models for Southeast Asian languages. And they said that if you have about like 5,000 instruction pairs, you can definitely tell a difference between the model before it encountered those instruction pairs and the model after, even if those 5,000 pairs are a tiny like 0.001% of the overall data the model is trained upon, because the data is so germane to the problem. So if you fine tune on really topical data in like a pre-training stage or on some existing model that's built on kind of less high quality data, you can see pretty good performance gains. Another approach that's really popular right now in literature is synthetic data. This idea that, we've got terabytes and terabytes of pretty good English language data out there. If we can just, run it through Google Translate, we can get terabytes and terabytes of pretty good Spanish data out there, and then we can use that to train our models. This, of course, relies on a magic trick, which is these two little arrows between English and Spanish here. You need to have really good machine translation, even in very popular language pairs like English to Spanish. Anyone who has spent time working with these translation tools will know that at scale, the quality of these tools is unnatural. It's not as good as natural language. It's often a bit jilted, a bit unusual, esoteric in translation, and sometimes just flat out wrong. And when you're training a model at scale and you give it millions of examples of slightly wrong answers, you can often amplify those mistakes and those shortcomings in the training algorithm, such that your model speaks very broken or very bad Spanish, even if each example is kind of okay-ish. And so one of the challenges here is, if you're trying to synthesize data, how do you build a language synthesis tool that gives high enough quality data? I saw one really neat paper that came out earlier this year, maybe a few months ago, that said that that basically took that instruction strategy I talked about earlier, where you get those instruction response pairs, and was like, what we can do is we can write the instructions, the questions, using synthetic data, and then pull the answers from the internet in authentic, genuine data, like data that was written by a human with the correct grammar and the correct style. And so what they did is they basically took the text of Wikipedia articles, and then they used AI to generate questions that would give that text as an answer. So you'd have a question like, who was the first president of the United States? Tell me about him. And then you take the Wikipedia article for George Washington as the answer in the actual language that showed up on the internet. And this is pretty good because you can take that, the overall portion of the data that's coming from kind of your wonky, low quality machine translation tool is just the question stage. But the answers, the majority of the text that the model is learning, and importantly, the portion of the text that the model is learning to generate, tends to be closer to natural language. And these authors found that this strategy dramatically improved the performance for low resource languages, because you could create synthetic data that wasn't entirely synthetic. You could basically augment it. Of course, this still requires some machine translation. So what do you do when there isn't a drop-down button in Google for your language? What do you do when you want to build a language model and there isn't a machine translation tool, or the machine translation tool is so bad that you cannot use it effectively? This is a really cool paper that came out of Brown earlier this year that encapsulates a strategy that I thought was really neat, which is a recognition that like maybe we don't have machine translation tools, but most languages, even very low resource languages, have these bilingual lexicons. They're basically dictionaries, which say like, this word in English is roughly equivalent to this word in insert language here. And these dictionaries are obviously not the same as a machine translating tool, but what the authors found is that they can be used to generate like reasonable-ish synthetic data by doing very dumb translation. So instead of relying on the magic of those two arrows, what you do is you put in an individual word and you get that word back in the bilingual pair, and then you structure it according to the original grammar. So this gives you wonky, broken translations, right? Because it doesn't actually incorporate the grammar of the target language. It only incorporates the vocabulary while following the word order and syntax of the teacher language, which in this example is English. But what it has the power to do is teach the model context for words that are missing from a dictionary, like synonyms, because you can just leave those in the training language, but keep all the rest of the vocabulary around it the same. And so when you combine this kind of bilingual pairing approach with additional data, synthetic data or organic data, you can often teach a model some aspects of a language that it might be missing in a low resource context, and you can expand the amount of resource you have. The problem is that, of course, if you do this too much, you end up stomping out really important grammatical concepts. And much like in the original case where we're using machine translators, you can teach the model some facsimile of the language that you're trying to target because of the artifacts this approach. One other kind of neat thing about this approach is that instead of going, like in this example, I've got English to Maori, which is a really distant pairing of languages. If you have a machine translation or like a really good data set in a kind of related language, like another Polynesian language or a similar language family, it seems that this approach is a little bit more robust because you have some more of the grammatic artifacts that will transfer over when you're developing the language model. Another neat approach that's entirely different, has nothing to do with synthetic data, that I thought was really fun, came out of Google research, I think 2 years ago, and it was called Machine Translation from One Book. And it was basically this strategy where within the context of like a chat conversation with a language model, you say, here is a textbook describing my language. It's the authoritative textbook on this language, WebDings or whatever. Read the textbook and then answer every question I ask you according to the grammar rules and vocabulary presented in the textbook. And what the authors found is that for very low resource languages, languages where the model may have like never encountered anything about it, in this case, they did it with a language that had less than 200 living speakers, the model could do like surprisingly well, just relying on what it learned from the authoritative textbook on the subject. Unfortunately, much like anyone who's tried to learn a language from a textbook or by sitting in a classroom for many years, it's very clear that the quality that you get from these kinds of approaches, this linguistic description approach, is never going to approximate what you get through immersion, through experiencing the language. And that's more or less the same for language models. It doesn't seem like our current large language models are capable of using a grammar book sufficiently to actually reach near native communication. And it's not exactly clear what levers we can tune to get them to do that. This is an unsolved problem. I think it's actually a problem where like traditional NLP research and a lot of the like linguistics research of the early 2000s might be able to come into play with this idea that there are like ways to describe and use language that aren't just through weights in a neural network. But this is extremely recent research, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to move this along and think like, could we describe a language such that it would be useful to an LLM? And is there something better than a textbook that we could make that does that? So that's like a research area that I at least personally see some promise in. Finally, if you're like digging in the academic literature here, a lot of work has been done on pre-training. So what you do is you take an existing model in English and then you fine tune it with examples of your target language. The idea being that there's like some intuition the model has gotten about the world, like what a banana is, that is universal. And it just needs to learn how to describe the banana in your low resource language in order to have adequate performance in that language. And so some of the strategies in there include familiar transfer, which I talked about a little bit, which is like leaning on models that are trained in similar languages, like related language families, and taking your embeddings, which is basically like a vector description of what a word means from that existing model when you start training, as opposed to like initializing your model with random weights. So you initialize it with like the weights for another Polynesian language, and then you refine it to speak Tuvaluan or something. Another approach is at the tokenization stage. So tokens are basically the fundamental units of a language model's grammar. So like the word running might have two tokens, run and ing, which together encapsulate some idea in the grammar. Right now, the way we tokenize things, the way we map combinations of characters into numbers that the models can work with, is very English dominant. It's kind of rooted in English grammars and kind of how we understand the English language. There might be no ways of tokenizing languages, like focusing on syllables, which are very universal. Most languages are spoken, so there's some kind of like thing the human throat does to make that sound. Could be something that you could lean on for lower resource languages. Another thing is just kind of cheating and at inference time, boosting your target language so that answers with specific tokens in the question, like the language of the question, are prioritized over answers that don't have them. So if a question is asked in Chinese, you prefer an answer that has Chinese characters, for example, and you can kind of build that into the architecture of your model, which can improve the performance and get rid of that code switching problem I mentioned earlier, where a lot of models will like switch to English halfway through an answer, by encouraging them to stick with the same language throughout their answer. Finally, even more into the weeds, there are like specific strategies in the design and architecture of your model, which can improve performance in languages. The way that you keep track of word order and memory can be really important. There are certain strategies for helping models basically generate examples of text that are longer than the examples they encountered during training. And it seems that that kind of approach works really well for languages that have flexible word order. So if you think of like a language like Latin, where the order of the words doesn't matter very much because each word embeds a lot of grammatical information in it, it may be that the way that you encode that language and the positioning of words for the model during training, and more importantly during inference, can help improve performance in those languages. Also, a big problem when you're fine-tuning a model generally is this concept of catastrophic forgetting. A lot of the approaches we use to train language models today, and generally a lot of deep learning approaches, models tend to overwrite information they learned in the past with fresh information, basically forgetting stuff. And so there are a lot of strategies in the literature that folks are working on to basically remind models of the things they've learned and kind of incorporate new data with a representative data set of like old experiences and memories, so that as the model is getting trained, it doesn't forget key themes or information it's learned in the past. And so that's an area of research as well, so that like your model doesn't happen to forget what a banana is as it's learning the new language. It keeps both bits of information. Finally, completely out there approach that I thought was just really fun is this idea that we should forget about written language altogether and just go from sound waves to sound waves. So there's been a lot of emergent research on basically taking, like training a model on the samples being an input sound and an output sound, and skipping the stage where you would translate it into textual language. And this is a really compelling area of research, in part because speech contains so much more context than writing. You have information about the age of the speaker, their gender, how passionate they are, how fast they're talking, how loudly they're talking, that can kind of convey more information for the same bytes of data potentially, or at the very least for the same amount of human effort in accruing that data. So it may be that for low resource language projects, working directly in the audio space is a way to build data sets that can be more useful than trying to go via the translation space, especially for languages where there may be only a couple dozen speakers who would have the motivation to carry a microphone and build these data sets and work on it for linguistic preservation. So that's the data scarcity space. I think it's the longest part of this presentation because there's the most work. Hopefully what I've conveyed is that these are solvable problems, but they're not solved problems. This is an area of active research and how to overcome data scarcity, but it seems pretty likely that the state of the art today is far from the best state possible for getting these models to be able to perform adequately in foreign languages or in low resource languages. So another domain that's really important here is the talent and access question that I talked about earlier. In building a language model, it's really important to incorporate people who understand and appreciate and treasure the language, or you end up with kind of a cursory performance where you're like, oh, my model passes, X benchmark in 600 languages, published me at NeurIPS, and then I'm going to move on with my life. And that's not really what we want to do as model builders and researchers, but it's very tempting as academics to kind of focus on those cursory performance metrics. I think one of the best strategies in this domain is to find ways to empower those kind of unicorn engineers I was talking about earlier, the people who can both understand a language model and understand a language, and to figure out ways to improve the ability of motivated individuals who care about their language to take ownership of the process of building these models, instead of it being something that's done by a random university lab or a big tech company in some foreign country. If people can have some kind of ownership over their data, some sovereignty over the tools that they're building, we'll end up with models that are more respectful of the nuances of a language and of the whole purpose of doing this in the first place. Towards achieving that, I think there's like a part which is like training people in AI and educating folks, which I think is very palatable to Universities NZ audience. But there's both the like training in the classroom, but there's also the tradecraft training. And I think that's much harder to come by and relies on giving people access to projects and compute to be able to play around with ideas. You can understand how a language model works in a classroom, but until you've like cleaned a linguistic data set and trained something on it and seen how it works and messed with hyperparameters, you don't really understand how to contribute to production-ready models. And I think a lot of that is that it's just inordinately expensive, especially for folks from low and middle income countries, to access the compute resources to build a language model. And giving people opportunities to join in on projects and have access to that tradecraft can be a really useful resource. In a kind of similar theme, there's this wider AI and tech ecosystem that is being built where people can exchange anecdotes, like that one I told you about the engineers in South Asia who are working on language models and found that like 5,000 instruction sets is a pretty good number to target. That's not like published anywhere. That's tradecraft that I got by being in the circle, in the community. And I think that we benefit from expanding that circle and expanding that community widely, both through bringing people together, through expert exchanges or job opportunities that target diverse populations, but also through an open ecosystem where a lot of tooling and kind of the fundamental infrastructure of AI is publicly available and accessible so that people don't have to start from scratch. I also think that we can work quite a lot to make things more accessible to non-technologists. There are a lot of people who are very passionate about preserving their language, using their language, preserving their culture, and would want to contribute if there was a way they could, whether that's contributing to data, testing if models are working correctly for them, or providing feedback to production-ready models in the wider tech ecosystem on what's working and what isn't. But it's vitally important that we make this accessible to non-technologists, to people who are interested in language and not interested in AI, or interested in culture and not interested in AI. AI should be a tool to like make the world we want to live in. It shouldn't be the end in and of itself. And I feel like often technologists, including myself, tend to lean a little bit more towards like computers are cool, that's good enough. when computers are never the point. They're the means to answering some other question. There's also a question for data entry work, especially like crowdsourcing data sets, on how we make it meaningful rather than monotonous. What we don't want to do is turn people into data entry bots that we can get our publications or beat the competing company on some benchmark. What we want to do is make people feel ownership and inclusion in something they're passionate about and care about. I think I've already talked on this enough, but it's important to know just how complicated it is to go from the theory of a language model to the execution. There are a bajillion questions that you'll find yourself asking, everything from how do I host things to where do I put my source code to which learning rate should I use or which hyperparameter should I use. And I think the more that we as academics and as governments can publish best practices and build toolkits and resources that are technical and applied and answer these questions, the better we pave the way for making it easy for talented and passionate individuals to get involved. Finally, on the commercial incentive space, this is probably the topic I have the least to say on because it's not as like substantively academic as everything else, but I think it is important to at least touch upon. I think one of the best things that we can do in a research context and in an academic context is to make models cheaper to host. Right now, it's very expensive to run an AI model. It's very expensive to build an AI model for your community or your country if you're in a small country. And I think that we can dramatically improve the state of the art there by committing towards building small language models and kind of supporting projects that target that and thinking like, how could someone with a single server in a small country build an AI product without having to go off to some big cloud data center somewhere to do it? Because that means that that person who's motivated to support their language would have the tools to kind of work on that. Another thing that we're working on in the State Department and in my day job is trying to use policy levers, the power of governments to encourage industry to step up and provide compute and capacity and resources to the global community. We announced about 2 months ago the Partnership for Global Inclusivity on AI. This is a $100 million pool of compute and resource grants from 8 big tech companies to work specifically on projects like the ones I've been talking about to support low resource languages or AI generally for low and middle income countries. And we are extremely keen as a department to find projects that work on low resource languages in the Pacific context. So if you're in the audience and you're like, wow, if only I had some GPUs and some resources, I could solve this problem. I could move the needle here and make the world a better place for people to use AI, especially in low and middle income countries. Hit me up. I'll put my email at the end of the slides. We're going to be opening a solicitation for grants in like later this month, probably. And we're looking to move fast and really pick some promising projects here, but also generally as people who are empowered to shape government and influence government from your academic seats or your policymaking seats, thinking about what kind of resources are lacking and how to get those resources to the people who need them is one of the most powerful tools we have, because we don't care about commercial incentives in the same way. We care about making the world that we want to live in and encouraging the commercial sector to follow. Finally, I think that there are many opportunities to amplify and collaborate. That's one of the reasons I traveled to New Zealand. One of the reasons I'm giving this talk is I think that sharing our technology, our expertise, our talent, even literally our time zones, being able to have a team of engineers in New Zealand work on servers while the Americans are asleep and the compute is cheap is incredibly compelling, and vice versa. So I think there are lots of opportunities for international collaboration and collaboration at all levels, from turning students into experts or exchanging experts across borders that can really build that tradecraft and overcome some of these barriers that have made advancing in low resource languages prohibitively expensive. So that's it for me. I think there are 3 key themes for me from this talk. One is that the data sparsity problem seems nasty and seems intrinsic to building these models. This sense that like there's not enough data out there, how are we going to build these models, is very omnipresent in the literature right now, but I think it can be overcome. There are a lot of very promising techniques out there, and I think these are still early days. Actually achieving, outside of academia and publications, models that are useful to people in the languages that they care about is something that will require authentic collaboration, not just academic theory crafting or commercialization efforts, but genuinely bringing in stakeholders who are passionate and treasure their language at all levels of the development process. And that relies on partnerships. I don't think it's something that any one country, company, or government can do alone, but I think it's well within our capacity as like a species on this planet to preserve these languages before they disappear. And I'm really excited to be in a space where we can think about that and work on it together. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any ideas or questions, I'd love to hear them now. I've also got an email on this slide. You can reach out anytime. I'd love to engage on any ideas you have for collaborating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. That was absolutely fascinating and a huge amount of content to absorb. I'd like to open the floor now to anybody who's got questions. Perhaps if you could introduce yourself and your role and your university, and then go with your questions. Okay. I'm not seeing anybody at the moment. Martin.
Kia ora, Marty Gagnon, the Research and Enterprise Office at the University of Otago. Thanks, James. This is really, really interesting, and it's a personal chord. Being a sort of a native French speaker, but from a part of the world that speaks a very different French or kind of French than what you have in Europe. So I wonder, how do you deal with local dialects and regionalism, like beyond just accent, but different vocabulary altogether? And how does that bias these models?
It's a great question. I think that it's something it kind of follows the same general themes that we've been covering, where you treat dialects almost as if they're different languages, but you have the benefit of getting that pre-training stage where there's like clearly some similarity between dialects of French, even if they're quite different. The issue is that code switching problem where the model like turns dialect French into standard French, right? And so figuring out how to build a model that's dialect aware at all stages can be quite tricky. I know there's really great work coming out of Singapore's IMDA, which is like their AI government authority, specifically on like Singlish, for example, which is like a Chinese English hybrid dialect. And like there's a lot of work in that kind of domain on how to make a model that feels natural in a language that isn't a textbook language. But yeah, it's definitely an important problem and one that people are working on.
Because often those the differences are spoken, not necessarily written. And I see it in Quebec, where I'm from. The written French is, I say, international French, but the spoken French are very, very different. And there are more and more examples in literature and in songwriting of using the phonetic Quebec French instead of the more appropriate, to some degree, international French or French French. And but it's still a very small amount of work that would capture those differences. So
yeah, that's
can
a
those
great
models
point.
deal with that?
I think the avenue for that specific problem, where like people speak different than they write, that I see as most promising is that focus on treating models more as an audio thing and language more as an audio concept than a written concept, with writing being like a tool that we use to move our language from place to place, but not the language itself. So work on like tokenizing around syllables is one strategy for written words. So focus more on like how the language sounds than what the language looks like on a page. And then the other strategy is that audio to audio model space that I was talking about earlier, which is like, can we build language models just based off of sound waves and not based off of writing, and then convert to text later in the pipeline, like once we have our answer, or convert to text never, right? Just convert directly to audio and make it like speaking to a human. Both, I think, are inroads to that problem, but are like very much on the frontier right now of how we build language models.
Thanks.
No problem. Great question.
Thank you so much, James. I can see that Bronwyn's got a question.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, James. That was absolutely phenomenal. Fascinating presentation. I've got two questions. I'll reserve the second question if nobody else has a question. But my first question to you is I'd like to know a little bit more about your trip to New Zealand, the reasons for coming out here and what you learned while you were here, and specifically with regards to opportunities for future collaboration with our New Zealand universities, apart from the fund that you mentioned in your previous slide. As we were talking just before our guests joined us, 2024 marks the 150th anniversary of the New Zealand US scientific collaboration. So way back in 1874, monitoring the transit of Venus was the first foray where we had both US and New Zealand scientists working together. So with that in mind, what does the future look like for collaboration between the US and New Zealand, particularly in your field of expertise?
It's a really good question. So the reason I came out to New Zealand in large part was our Deputy Secretary of State had come to New Zealand earlier this year and announced a critical and emerging technologies dialogue between our two countries, specifically really to answer that question about the next 150 years of the relationship and kind of build on this legacy of collaboration in science and technology, as well as just generally between our two countries. And I was sent basically as a follow-up to engage with technical experts in AI and quantum and a little bit of biotech and find specific tangible opportunities to partner between our countries. So I followed around a science speaker who we sent through an ECA speakers program, which is a program where we bring American scientists to different countries around the world to talk with scientific experts. So I basically followed her and was just like, anyone who's interested in talking to her is probably someone I want to talk to. And I met a ton of really neat stakeholders from across New Zealand. We gave a podcast talk at WETA on like creative industries and AI. We spoke with Maori leadership on different iwi's perspectives on data sovereignty and cultural treasures and data treasures and that kind of debate, which I think New Zealand is having in a way that the rest of the world is basically burying their head in the sand and ignoring right now. And so there was like a lot of input that came to me from many different parties. We went to speak with the cross-party working group on AI and Parliament at the Beehive, and hear kind of some political perspectives about like jobs and how New Zealand can tap into this amazing opportunity for technical innovation as a relatively small market, but can do so in a way that still preserves the dignity of everyone having meaningful, fulfilling work. And I think some themes that emerged for me from the visit, one was that New Zealand is significantly ahead of the world in the specific context of low resource languages, both the preservation of cultural languages, the work that's been done in Te Reo Maori even before AI is really advanced and sophisticated, but also the work specifically in developing language models that can support these languages, not just like ChatGPT style large language models, but also like audio transcription models. I know that someone, Peter Lucas Jones from Tehiko Media, was in Times AI 100 recently for the work done in transcription models for Te Reo Maori, for example. And that's something I think the US could really learn from and benefit from. We go to a lot of other countries that are like, we would like technical assistance from America in building a sovereign language model, in preserving our cultural heritage, in supporting our language. And we don't have the same expertise that y'all have. So I think that's a great opportunity for expert exchange. The last area I think that's really important is that New Zealand has been is a really environmentally conscious country. And for our engagements in the Pacific, climate is one of the most important things that comes up. How to deal with natural disasters, how to be more resilient to floods, and how to be more environmentally sustainable as folks modernize. And are there modernization opportunities that are sustainable? So thinking both about like disaster management from a very like technical hands-on approach, like what research could we do with Earth observation data to help reduce the harms of a typhoon or something, but also from a like more political standpoint, like how can we build data centers? How can we grow technically in a way that's environmentally sustainable, is a final area for collaboration. So that was a very long answer to a pretty straightforward question, but hopefully it gives you a sense. Super tangibly, we're having conversations over the next couple of months, some like expert exchanges to grow the relationship. I think academia will play a role in that. If there are academics who are like, I want to collaborate with the US on a specific topic, there's like this person in the US I'd like to meet or get connected with. State Department's like very much a front door to America in a lot of ways. So we can often act as like a switchboard to make those connections. And I think we're going to be looking for opportunities to do that.
Wow, fabulous. Thank you so much, James. And if I can offer Universities New Zealand as the reciprocal organisation to help establish partnerships, please feel free to steer anyone our way. So thank you so much. Liz, I have a second question, but only if nobody else has got a question.
I'll just check in. I'm not seeing any other hands up, but if somebody else does have a question, please put your hand up now. If not, Bronwyn will have her next question.
Okay, thank you. James, in a previous life, I was a speech pathologist, and so I'm particularly interested in the application of the software in the diagnostics and treatment of language disorders, well, speech and language disorders, things like aphasia. There's various types of aphasia, and speech and language therapists, as they're known in New Zealand, and pathologists in the US are responsible for diagnosing these. Given that these language learning models can have auditory inputs, what's the potential application for speech pathology in practice?
It's a great question. It's extremely outside of my like niche of expertise. So with that caveat, I think there is a lot of exciting potential. I know that in the US, our goodness, I forget which agency. I think it was our FDA. It might be our Health and Human Services Agency, but one of them recently released a report that talked about like AI in clinical settings. And I think speech and language pathology was like part of the use cases they explored. And I think it's because that potential is really strong. Anecdotally, I spoke with a researcher who was doing really cool work on like detecting certain like disorders that have manifestations in speech. So like if someone's about to have a stroke or is like early onset dementia, it may be possible that like their speech and writing patterns can be indicators of this long before the like more common symptoms are picked up. They were like a PhD student, so who knows how far that research will end up going. But I think it's super cool, this idea that like maybe you can get treatment for a disorder before the symptoms are so severe that people notice, if we can monitor these trends, these data trends that might be hiding. So that's where my mind went with that question, but I don't have like the perfect answer for you on it.
No, that's fantastic. You know, it's good to know that this is being applied, because the other issue that we face obviously is access to speech and language therapy services for those who are native speakers of languages other than English, for instance. So having a model that could detect disorders in a language that differs to the native speaker of the therapist or the native language of the therapist would be extremely useful in terms of accessibility of treatment to those, you know, all around the world. So, lots of exciting things. So thank you so much. And also I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, James, on behalf of Universities New Zealand, for agreeing to talk to us today and for coming to New Zealand in the first place. What a wonderful opportunity to get to know you. So just expressing a thanks on behalf of all 8 universities of New Zealand.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor to speak with you all, and I hope that it's the first of many conversations. So.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up, so we will close shortly. Thank you, James, for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. We're very grateful that you managed to join us today, particularly as we appreciate that you've given up your evening to be with us from the other side of the world. Bronwyn will now close today's session with a karakia.
Right, can everybody see that?
We can.
Okay, great. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru papu nui. Kia wātia, kia mama tēnā kau. Te tinana, te wairua ki te ara tangata. Ko ia rā e rongo, whakairihia ake ki rongo. Kia tina, tina, hui e, tai ki e.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for attending today, and special thanks to James. Bronwyn, I think, will be sharing just a couple of links where you can get more information on James and some of the work that he's done. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks so much.
James, thanks, Liz.
Okay, bye-bye.